The warrant officer stood still as a lamppost outside of Trixie's tent, his chin raised uncharacteristically high. Around him, unicorns rushed to and fro as preparations were made for battle. Helmets were donned, plumes were preened, fires were snuffed, and tents were taken down as the warrant officer stood stock still. None of them had the rank to make him act, of course. But even the great and powerful Trixie herself couldn't have moved him from that spot. I guess that's just it, he reflected. Every pony could feel the strange or change in the air, the lingering hum of magic, even after Her Majesty's departure. Something powerful remained behind. Some pony, he corrected himself. Something soft and dormant, but terrifying in its latency. Standing outside of Trixie's tent was like watching an Ursa sleep, knowing full well that the peace of its slumber could become mortal danger in mere moments. And yet, the warrant officer felt strangely at peace. Perhaps the stark terror that had gripped him from earlier had simply drained even his vast allotment of fear. Or perhaps because even life-threatening calm was a vacation in comparison. His body remained rigid as ever, but mentally he shook his head. If any pony knows fear, it's me, he admitted, in equal parts shame and reassurance. But that's just it. I know fear. After Her Majesty's spell had ended, the warrant officer had stood as still as he was now. He could only stare in astonishment at the duo in front of him, incapable of listening as they exchanged words. It was a vague blur to his mind, shell-shocked. But he remembered that Nightmare Moon had cast another spell. Trixie had said something in return, and just like that the queen had vanished. The space of several minutes was a blur, to be sure, but the warrant officer remembered one particular moment. I know fear, he reminded himself, as he let the picture crystallize. Trixie had kept her eyes locked on the spot where Nightmare Moon had vanished, her mouth slowly splitting into a grin. She had begun laughing, as the warrant officer had learned to expect, as her gaze stared unbelieving at the spot where her leader had vanished. The warrant officer also stared unbelieving. Unlike Trixie, however, he had never spared a glance for the alicorn. Instead, his gaze was locked on his own beautiful leader. She didn't know it then, and maybe never would again. But he had seen it. I know fear, he told himself again. There was no doubt about it. For a moment, as small as it seemed, Trixie had been terrified. There was something fundamentally wrong with this, the warrant officer knew. Fear was for ponies like him, ponies who were beneath the greatness that was Trixie. Fear kept him in line when he may have otherwise fled, kept him loyal when he may have otherwise deserted. Those who were too foolhardy or too stupid to listen to their fears found themselves made example of, a lesson the warrant officer knew all too well. The great and powerful Trixie was above such things as fear. The warrant officer knew this as surely as he knew the lowliest of his place. But he also knew fear, and right now the two were in direct opposition. Warrant officer. Without willing himself to, the warrant officer turned towards the sound of the voice. No, not the sound exactly, more like the lamentation. Any unicorn nearby surely sensed the being inside the tent he guarded. A glass so full to the brim with water that even the slightest ripple threatened to spill it all. The smoldering destruction of a volcano was mere yards away from him, and it was calling his name. His horn flickered dimly as he swatted the tent flap aside, striding inside. He wasn't sure what to expect, but it certainly wasn't what he saw. Trixie was standing, in her normal Royal Guard uniform, still staring at the spot where Nightmare Moon had vanished. To an observer, nothing seemed to have changed. Warrant officer, she said out loud this time. It occurs to me that, like our good queen, I have underestimated my inferiors. She turned her head slowly to face him, and now the warrant officer could see a difference. Chills ran down his spine, bringing the familiar feeling of fear almost within reach, as he looked into her entirely white eyes. Somehow, my little warrant officer, you managed to evade Nightmare Moon's lie detection. In so doing, you performed your role in my plan far beyond my expectation. Trixie advanced a step, but the warrant officer didn't retreat. It's all so disjointed, he rambled to himself. Like, this isn't really happening. This can't be happening. Such service, as our most esteemed ruler put it, deserves a reward. Her horn began to glow as she reached down, tapping his forehoof lightly. You've come a long way from the sniveling brat I found you as. Fear does that to a pony. Fear when I hear my name called, dread in the silence between. Her horn began to glow faintly, but the warrant officer still wasn't scared. Fear is for ponies like me. Nightmare Moon has been granting me her power, drop by drop, for months now. A small request here, an earned reward there, and I have grown. But now this? The warrant officer was once again reminded of how dangerous his situation was, how unstable Trixie's power felt. Even still, he found it almost difficult to worry. My greatest plan to date, and I am so close. I want to show you, Trixie continued slowly. And you deserve to be rewarded. I know you didn't kill the captain. It was the only way you could have fooled Nightmare Moon. Still, you adapted to the situation better than I could ever have dreamed. For your acts of service, and by my good graces, I insist of sharing a little of my wealth. A small taste, if you will. You've earned it, my little officer. The warrant officer's eyes crossed as he focused on the horn touching his head, his mind blank except for disjointed thoughts. As it began to glow, his eyes finally began to widen. Congratulations on your promotion, General. Trixie cooed as her horn began to shine. Time was a funny thing. Twilight had read books of ponies that had been trapped in caves or locked in a cell for a long time, and after just a few hours of not seeing the sun, their senses of time all but disappeared. Twilight couldn't help but consider these claims validated as she looked longingly at the broken clock in Rarity's bedroom. How long has it been? She asked nobody in particular. Half an hour? Applejack muttered around her hooves, her face planted downwards as she sat on the edge of Rarity's bed. A couple hours? Rainbow Dash said at the same time, laying her back across the same bed. Twilight sighed, walking over to the clock. Upon reaching it, she turned back towards the door, falling into a quick pace. Time was a very funny thing. How ponies measured it out like drops of sand in an hourglass. Take away the sand, however, and all you have left is with a series of events. At some point in the past, they had apologized to Applejack. At some point after that, they decided to wait for Rarity's return to ask her about her element of harmony. Now, at some point in time indistinguishable from the others except that it was now, they were still waiting. And at some point, now would become then, and Rarity would return. The moment came with a soft creak, making the 3 sets of ears perk up in unison. Twilight turned from the clock, her hooves aching slightly from the constant motion of her pacing. Rarity stood in the doorway, her eyes wide and darting to each pony. Dash sat up in the bed, while Applejack lifted her face from her hooves, and for some amount of time each pony just stared at the others. I'm sorry. Twilight broke the silence. I forgive you, my dear. No, Wait, just like that? We have more important things to do than fight amongst ourselves, Twilight. And keeping every pony alive is one of them. Twilight resisted the urge to shoot a smile in Applejack's direction, instead trying to figure out what to say next. I hadn't really expected that to go so easily, she thought. Hopefully my luck will hold today. Rarity, she began. We have a plan to stop Neighbor Moon. We need to reassemble the elements of harmony, and their bearers, and use the magic of friendship to drain their powers, like we did in my world. Twilight bit her lip, knowing that it sounded hopelessly naive in their current situation. Rarity continued to stare wide-eyed at the other unicorn, and a nagging thought began in the back of Twilight's head. Pushing it aside for now, she focused on the task at hand. Applejack, have they explained this plan to you? Yes, they have, Rarity. And what do you think? I think it's a whole lot of nonsense, personally. Applejack was avoiding Twilight's gaze, keeping her eyes fixed on Rarity's. And if we face Neighbor Moon head-on, and we put them pretty rocks don't work, then we're cooked as sure as apple pie. Applejack sighed, plopping her head back into her hooves. But we're as good as cooked from just sitting here, too. So I don't see why we can't just try. Come on, Rarity. Dash, who had been silent up to this point, was suddenly in the air right in front of the white unicorn. We know they can work, and just like AJ said, it's the best chance we got. Rarity, who had lifted a hoof across her chest defensively, relaxed and let out a sigh. Nudging her way past the Pegasus, she walked slowly to Applejack's side. Confused, Applejack looked up at the mayor, but Rarity had already ducked her head down and was pulling it at a drawer to the bed to stand next to her. The three ponies watched in silence as Rarity fished about inside, finally reemerging with something held in her mouth. Laying it down on the bed quietly, and rubbing her mouth disdainfully with her hooves, Rarity gestured with her horn. I grabbed it as we fled because of how beautiful I thought it was. Sadly, even for my fabulosity, priorities change, and it's been locked away collecting gross, foul-tasting dust for some time. Giving her tongue one final brush off, Rarity shook out her mane and regained her composure. You are welcome to it, if you think it'll help. However, Applejack and I must remain here to defend the town, while you look for whatever else you need. Rainbow Dash walked over to examine the object, which to Twilight just seemed like an ordinary box. With a prod from Dash's hoof, however, the box opened to reveal a glimmering brooch adorned with 3 diamonds, the light from which glistened in Twilight's slowly widening eyes. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you! Twilight found herself wrapping around her Rarity in a hug, which the other unicorn gently returned with one hoof. We've already got 4 bearers, and now an actual element. We can do this! I know we can! Not to cut it short, Twi, Dash interrupted, scooping up the box in one hoof. But we can all thank each other after we've defeated Nightmare Moon. We've got what we wanted now, so let's go find the others. She's right, came a voice from above Twilight. The purple unicorn looked up into Rarity's gentle smile, the first she had seen in weeks. If this plan has any hope of success, time is of the essence. Twilight detangled herself from Rarity, looking into her eyes gratefully. Again, in the back of her head, a thought had been nagging her, so this time she took a moment to address it. Rarity, your eyes. The smile faltered, a little of Rarity's old self coming back. My eyes? What about them? Is something wrong with them? No, they just aren't as black. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the room was suddenly filled with frantic motion, with barely enough time to yelp in surprise. Dash and AJ had picked up Rarity and laid her down on the bed, hovering over her. I reckon I do see a little more white around the edges after all. Wow, you're right. Her eyes are going back to normal. Well, a little bit anyway. Twilight had barely taken a step towards the distressed unicorn when her vision had filled with a purple orb. Backing up in surprise, she realized it was Rainbow Dash's eyes peering into her own. You know, Twi, I think your guys are going back to normal too. But what does this mean? Rarity cried out in distress, struggling under AJ's hooves. Twilight could only smile in relief, giggling slightly to herself. It means whatever Trixie did is starting to wear off. It's just wearing off slowly. AJ sat up, releasing the captive Rarity. If we have a unicorn magical battle, we might be able to hold him off. Will it return that fast? Rarity asked, pausing to fix her mane. Twilight walked over to the unicorn, finally getting a good look at her eyes. I don't know for sure, Twilight admitted, but Trixie wouldn't have used this spell if it was going to wear off right as she attacked. Not unless something held her up. Still, it is better than nothing, AJ supplied. Twilight was glad to see that at least some pony elves was intent on keeping the mood up. But it ain't gonna come back any faster without just sitting around talking about it. Magic or no, we got a whole lot of work to do. Twilight nodded as Dash murmured agreement, and Rarity finally extracted herself from the bed. Leaving her mane slightly deceived, she stopped fixing herself long enough to give Twilight a tentative hug. Good luck, my dear, she said softly. I fear we'll all need it. We'll see you guys soon, Dash called out from the doorway before zipping out of sight. Good luck to y'all. AJ waved as Twilight made her way out of the door. Time was a funny thing, Twilight knew. The goodbye lasted only seconds, but it seemed to stretch into hours. Her last image before the door closed was of Applejack waving, her smile seeming almost bashful. Just for a moment, all the stress and anger of reality had vanished, and Twilight had seen her friends again. Time was a funny thing, but as she and Dash made their way downstairs, that moment kept lasting in her head. Just a moment, Twilight knew, but without clocks or the sun to keep track of time. Who was to say how long a moment really lasted? Now what? Twilight snapped out of her thoughts, realizing she was standing in front of Rarity's office. Now, she grinned, we begin again, at the beginning. It's time to return to Ponyville. Inside of Rarity's office, Rarity and Applejack stayed silent as they stared at the closed door. They're gone, Applejack's helpfully supplied. Yes, Rarity responded, her voice quiet. Now what? Now, Rarity stated as she drew her chin up. We must make absolutely sure that there is a new Ponyville for them to return to.